Okay, I think we've probably got most of the people now joined, so we're going to start the webinar. Um, so good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Robert Boyle, Managing Director of Gridpoint Consulting. I had a background in the aviation industry, much of it with British Airways and IAG, and I'm going to be your chair for the session today. We have a Q&A function, which is now open, so please feel free to submit your questions. We've had a few questions submitted in advance, which we'll try and feed into today's discussion as well. First of all, let me introduce the speakers for today. First, we have Peter Davis, who's the CEO of Airline Management Group. Peter's an experienced airline chief executive, has also been chair and non-executive director of a number of consumer and business service companies. Following on from Peter, also from Airline Management Group is Ben Leon, who's Chief Commercial Officer there. Over 25 years in the aviation industry, Ben has a track record of commercial leadership in challenging international environments across the industry. And finally, we have Paul Zelkin, Managing Director and Head of the Aviation Sector Group at Quantuma, and an experienced restructuring and insolvency specialist. So without further ado, we're going to get started. And I'm going to kick things off with the only PowerPoint slides you're going to see today, which is about 4 slides where I just give you a bit of an intro on the state of the industry. Could we have the first slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so this slide is data from Eurocontrol. This is flights within Europe, so any flight that comes in or out of Europe or within it. And it shows the number of flights, 7-day moving average, compared to pre-pandemic levels. So you can see here back at the beginning of May, Europe was running at about minus 65% compared to 2019. And that's been steadily increasing recently, up to about minus 40% or so by the start of July. So there's definitely an improvement happening here. But this is very low compared to other parts of parts of the world. Europe has really been lagging behind, and places like domestic US travel is pretty much back to, or even above in some instances, pre-pandemic levels. So Europe is improving, but from a very low base. The next slide, please. And if you look at that by country, you can see there, bottom right, this is the same data, but just for the final week. So this is numbers that average about minus 40% overall. UK and Ireland, by far the worst performers within Europe, pretty much minus 70%. And that's really reflecting of the level of travel restrictions that have been in place. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about yesterday's announcement, which hopefully will improve things. I've also split this chart into sort of 2 halves. On the left are the countries that you would think of as traditional sort of destination countries for leisure. So Turkey, Greece, Spain, Italy, and so forth. And the ones on the right are the places that people generally fly from when they're heading for the sun. And so you can see that the destination countries have probably been doing a little bit better. So, underpinning the fact that the leisure market is recovering a bit faster than the traditional sort of business market, which is a bigger factor for places like the UK and Germany. Okay, next slide. Where are we at in terms of the pandemic, which is ultimately driving things? You can see there, obviously, that the case numbers are beginning to take off again, obviously notably in the UK, but also across Europe. The left-hand slide shows, cases per million people. And you can see there, Portugal, which was on the green list from the UK until fairly recently, has got the Delta variant and has been taking off in cases. Also Spain rising, and likewise Greece. And I think, although some of the other European countries are actually at very low levels, like Italy and Germany, I think everyone believes that the Delta variant is getting going everywhere, and it's just a matter of time before we see, further wave, as we're seeing at the moment in the UK and other European countries. The chart on the right shows the data that we have on the proportion of cases that are Delta variant. So you can see there, rapidly rising, and I think, if you look at today's version of this chart on Our World in Data, these numbers have gone, much higher still. So we're going to get rising cases. If you go to the next slide. But obviously the big difference now is the proportion of people that have been fully vaccinated. And that gives you both a reduction in infection risk. So as we get to high levels of vaccination, that should begin to bring these waves back under control. The chart on the right shows at least one source for the reduction in infection risk from 1 or 2 doses. Some differences of view about how much protection you get from one, but definitely I think everyone agrees you get high levels of protection against both infection, spreading, and also severe, getting a severe case. So in a sense, the likelihood that we will get on top of this wave or despite the cases not have a rise in hospitalizations and so forth, really very dependent on the vaccination programs. Going well in the UK at the moment, and the rest of Europe that were slow getting going are catching up pretty fast. I think most of Europe is about a month behind the UK. 1 or 2 places like Malta are about a month ahead. So I think that was the last slide that I had to get things going, and I'd like to turn now to kick things off maybe to Peter. Where do you think we are, Peter, in the recovery? Is this going to be another largely lost summer for UK airlines, or did yesterday's announcement, maybe turn things around?
I think the problem, Robert, good morning, everyone, is a question of inconsistency. I think generally people, 1 minute they're told one thing, and then suddenly they read the small print or another message is given by the government or someone that suggests something else. So I think the travelling public are concerned about the inconsistency. But that falls into 2 camps. I think you've got a lot of people who are quite bullish, are obviously fully vaccinated and quite happy to travel. And indeed, they've been travelling for some time. My family have been travelling up on various domestic and European flights, and most times not necessarily to leisure destinations, and the aircraft have been quite full. And then obviously you've got a lot of other people who simply won't step outside their home. So I think there's a significant responsibility by the government, by people who think this thing through, who want to be able to get out and travel more extensively than they have in the past. So I think it falls into 2 camps. But generally, I mean, the honest answer is no one really knows because of that inconsistency. So, but certainly there's a feeling. I've been in London for the last couple of days. It was deathly quiet. It was just unbelievable. But when you speak to people in business, there's a strong feeling that we're getting back to some level of normality. The issue is, I suppose, if there's another variant, which inevitably there will be, then does that start the whole spin going? And of course, the airline industry, anyone in business hates inconsistency, but we certainly do. And try and plan and position people in aircraft becomes a nightmare. So I think we still have it's got a long tail, would be my answer to that question, Robert.
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, we got some relaxation yesterday for fully vaccinated people in the UK. But you need the other end to be open up as well, and particularly the US as a major market for a number of carriers. It's still not possible. The border is still closed for UK people travelling to the US. Grant Shapps yesterday said the meetings continue, and it sounded like something was still going to happen, but maybe not immediately. What's your view on the prospects for that, and how important is that for those airlines?
Right, critical. We'll come on to this later, I guess, in terms of the state of the balance sheet to the present moment. But I'll give you an example of inconsistency. My eldest son was going to travel to Malta with his family, 2 young children, and everything was fine. They booked, and then suddenly the Maltese turned around and said, "Well, you can't enter the country unless those under 18 have been vaccinated." And double vaccinated. Well, obviously, we know that the 8 weeks difference. So, as far as families who wish to go to Malta, whose children have not been double vaccinated, and most probably haven't, that's off limits. I'm not quite sure the Maltese will wake up to that. But and that comes back to my point earlier: the inconsistency. I think people are quite nervous and unsure as to when they can travel, how they should travel. It's there, and it's the responsibility of the passenger to make sure that they understand what the rules and regulations are. But my goodness, I don't know who it is, the politicians or the civil servants, but life is very complicated at the moment. It's almost borders on, in some respects, I'll be brave enough to say incompetency as opposed to some sort of conspiracy theory going on.
Yeah, absolutely. It is that inconsistency and uncertainty that I think is definitely deterring travel.
Yeah.
Maybe we could turn to Ben to talk a bit about business travel. You know, a lot is made in the newspapers about leisure travel because obviously that's what affects most people most keenly. But business travel is, the lifeblood of certainly a number of airlines. And also, as we get past the summer and head into another dark winter, business travel is normally the bright spot there, where September onwards is the sort of peak season for business travel. We're going to have, I think, most people fully vaccinated by then across the major, the developed economies. Do you think we have the stage set for a proper recovery in business from September? Ben, you're on mute.
That's the key question, Robert. I think I've been talking to business travel agents across Europe, and business travel for Europe in 2019 accounted for over 100 million visitors. And it's just under 20% of international visitors into Europe. And obviously for countries like the UK and Germany, as you mentioned before, we're not so huge on the leisure side and much more weighted towards business. The business travel agents that I've been speaking to have been seeing this year at 25% level of 2019. So business travel having reduced by 75% still. Where there is an uptick is there's a sort of behavioral lag. So once people have traveled for leisure, once people are more comfortable at going back to the office, once the government regulations relax in terms of being able to go to the office, then travel policies follow suit. But what we have seen is we've seen major corporations reducing their travel budgets last year by 50%, and that's likely to last this year. The positive news on the horizon is the latest statistics that come through from American Express Global Business Travel, particularly in the US, where domestic travel, as you mentioned earlier, is pretty much back up to 2019 levels. What they've noticed from that is that business travel has picked up as well. And if you ask in a poll, and we're going to be asking very soon, the number of people who believe that they're going to be traveling in the next 12 months, that's gone up in Europe to about 70% of people. In the States, it's gone up to 90% of the people. And it's not just the next 12 months, it's actually until the end of the calendar year. So there are positive signs on the horizon. But I don't think we can see back to 2019 levels. Worst case is probably 25% of 2019. Best case is probably about 35-40% of 2019.
In 2021?
In 2021, yeah.
Okay. You mentioned we were going to maybe engage the audience here. We have quite a few people that would normally be traveling a lot for business. Rather than, I think, ask you whether you're going to be traveling at all, I think one of the bigger questions that particularly for long-haul airlines, is what cabin you're likely to be flying in. So we're going to ask the participants on the call here to give us your view. So the poll should be going up around now. Okay, well, I'm going to click first class because I get first class travel free. Oh, no, I can't vote. Damn. Right, so the poll will be left up for a few minutes, but let's continue with the discussion. And when we've got the polls closed and we've got the results back, it'll be going into the chat, and then we can maybe pick it up in the later discussion. Okay, so Paul, so far we've seen only a few carriers in the UK going bust. I think Flybe managed to go bust pretty much before the pandemic even started, and Stobart is the most recent one, I think. If traffic is going to start to recover this year, do you think that airlines that have made it so far are really out of the woods? Are they okay now, or are we going to see more bankruptcies?
Thanks, Robert, and good morning, everybody. I wish I could say, yes, everybody's out of the woods, but I'm going to give you a definitive and succinct answer, and that is no. Look, there's no doubt the picture's not uniform across the major UK-based carriers, and I'm sure that some airlines are in a more precarious position than others. I mean, I'm not going to go into specifics. I'm not going to name names as such, but logically, I think anybody can work out that there will be some airlines who are going to be more worried than others because they simply don't have the same level of reserves to sort of dig into and the same capacity to, generate new, debt or equity. And we've already talked about business travel, and it is we can't emphasize enough how much and how important business travel is to certain airlines. So the fact that the transatlantic market is yet to return must be hugely problematic for any carrier which really relies upon business travelers crossing the pond, for instance, in a premium cabin. And until that comes back, there are airlines out there who are going to be still sort of scratching their head thinking, where do we go next?
Yeah, I just maybe would like to make a point myself here. I was been analysing the data that came out yesterday from the UK arrivals testing program. They published data, and that gave the figures for the volume of arrivals into the UK by country. And I was quite surprised, actually, to see that the USA was actually the third on the list. I think Spain was one, Portugal second, and then USA. So given that it's in fact the border is closed for UK people, and this must be really just people based in the US visiting the UK, with the quarantine requirements and all the onerous testing, I think it's perhaps maybe people are over exaggerating how much less long haul travel there is relative to short haul travel. We saw that over the Christmas period. Winter sun destinations, were doing well until it got put on the red list. Obviously, travel to India was one of the strongest parts of the market. So I think the view that short haul is definitely going to do better than long haul is at least worth questioning. I think it's a bit more complicated than that.
And I wonder as well, could I just mention, those travelers who are sort of inbound from the US to the UK, I suspect they're booking on United and American and Continental. I don't imagine they're necessarily using British Airways and Virgin, for instance, as the direct non-stops. Be interesting.
I'm sure it's pretty even. I think a lot of those people that I just know from people anecdotally, people who have been working or living in the States but basically come from the UK, have family back here, and they're the people that are desperate to come back and visit family and so forth. So maybe coming back to the bankruptcy and cash questions. Actually, before we do that, let me just talk a bit about the supply chain. Demand needs to come first. Once that is there and airlines start to ramp up operations, which they're doing at the moment, are we going to be starting to face issues with the supply chain? A lot of those key suppliers have had financial difficulties and so forth. Are we going to run into a whole bunch of supply chain bottlenecks? Peter, what do you think?
I think the supply chain is pretty robust in the aviation industry. You will know, and everyone will know, the regulatory requirements in terms of making sure that which you supply to the aviation industry is obviously in line with safety and security. My understanding, having spoken to a number of supply chain, and I'm talking about OEMs as well as of those plethora of companies that provide other parts and bits and pieces, they're pretty robust. Don't forget, the aircraft that haven't flown at least have had to be maintained. I think people often forget that you just don't park an aeroplane up as you do a car. Apart from the fact you might run out of battery, that doesn't happen quite with an aircraft. So I think if I remember correctly, it's something like 400 person hours a year just to maintain an aircraft on the ground. And naturally things, even though they're not flying, have to be exchanged and changed. So I'm pretty confident about the supply chain from a physical perspective. What I'm more concerned about is the supply chain of pilots and engineers. Clearly, a lot of pilots have maintained their hours by simulating traffic, and a lot of pilots have lost their jobs. The issue really is if there is a sudden upturn in terms of the global industry, and as you say, in some parts of the world that's beginning to happen, then that capacity, that demand would need to be matched by the right qualified and fully conversant pilots and engineers. So I think that could be a potential concern and will have an impact on the airline. But I'm pretty confident on the physical supply chain that's as robust as it has been. Now, what's happened to their balance sheets and the consequences of airports and ground handling companies, those that provide services as opposed to physical means, I think that's a very different picture.
Do you think airlines are going to struggle because of ground handling companies not being in the shape to support the revamp of operations?
I can't imagine. No, they are there. They're still in existence. What I don't know, and I must confess, it'd be interesting to have a conversation with a CFO or CEO as to how on earth have they balanced their balance sheet.
Mm. My guess is the handling companies, they're mostly people businesses. So, they've just furloughed their people and gone into hibernation mode. I think probably.
And they've kept the equipment. I mean, the equipment is fortunately, the equipment we use in ground handling has a long life. It's not as if it's over and done within a couple of years or so. So the asset, the physical assets in terms of the equipment, and then a lot of the equipment is provided by the airport itself, the infrastructure, of course. So I would agree with you. I think that, but even so, they're obviously. But I don't think they're going to go bust. I think they'll be there to provide the services to the airlines.
Yeah. Maybe the other part of travel infrastructure is the at the other end, at the destination, hotel infrastructure. Other things to do when you're there. What do you think, Ben? Is there been a kind of a permanent damage to that kind of travel infrastructure, hotel capacity, etc.?
So permanent damage, the latest forecast that I read, and speaking to people across the hotel industry, the biggest challenge that the hotels have and across the hospitality industry is actually recruitment at this moment. So with so many staff having been furloughed or having been made redundant and been let go, actually there's a dearth of frontline staff, and that's across the transport and logistics sector as well. And whilst we have a sort of double impact in the UK because of opening up of rush of opening up of hotels at similar time, and hospitality, restaurants and so on, we also have the added impact in the UK of Brexit, which has meant that there's probably 1.5 million European workers who used to work in the hospitality industry in the UK who are now back in their home countries, and that's causing a crunch here in the UK. But having spoken to colleagues in Barcelona, in Lisbon, in Brazil, in Jerusalem, in South Africa, actually the recruitment problem is a crunch point right now. That's probably a short-term impact that will probably even out over time. The other short-term impact is the infrastructure in the hotels. The air conditioning systems haven't necessarily been used, and various equipments that keep the buildings going. But I think what's happening is the different change in nature of travel. And one of the buzzwords in the hotel industry at the moment is repurposing. We will see a change and a shift in the kind of business travel and leisure travel that people are expecting. Certainly with people having experienced work from home, like we all have over the last 18 months, the idea of sort of taking leisure holiday coupled with business breaks will come into it. And so hotels will need to repurpose, and there's a sort of byline in de-leisure, business leisure. So that's something that hotels are grappling with. And it depends very much on their location. It depends very much on their target market, but there is going to be a shift. I see there's been a question about whether Zoom is going to have an impact on business travel. It's true that Zoom has been very effective, and IT platforms have been very effective to allow us to continue to converse, but I think everyone really misses that physical face-to-face connection. And so whilst that will change business travel, and it will change which trips you kind of don't need to pop over to another country just for a lunch meeting, you might have more condensed longer term trips rather than just single day trips. But again, hotels and the rest of the travel chain will have to adapt to that.
Travel agency is obviously one of the other parts of the supply chain. Do you think that the travel agents that emerge out the other end of this crisis will look the same? Will there be as many of them? Will it be only the big ones that will have survived? What's your view on the travel agent?
Well, we saw, big changes last year with some major retail chains collapsing, and really the online players, the ones who've been mainly OTAs, online travel agents, have been best placed. And again, it depends whether their focus has been business or leisure. So again, the leisure focused ones have seen the uptick in travel quite well in terms of every time there's been a border opening. The business focused ones have seen a lag, and we saw even in the UK, Canoe Travel, even one of the American Express approved agents that went into administration. We've seen quite a few that have gone into administration. There's been a few acquisitions in the travel agency space as well. And I think that where travel agents have used this opportunity to invest in their technology and technology platforms, and both on the leisure side and in terms of how they can improve their personalization and the experience that customers have using more front-end tools, that will be those companies who've used this opportunity to invest, stay close to their companies, will be the ones, stay close to their customers, will be the ones who emerge, and those who've not been quick enough to adapt will probably see the pain going forward.
Okay, so let's come back to some more kind of financial and cash and balance sheet type questions. Paul, airlines, lots of players, but particularly airlines, have taken on an enormous amount of debt through this crisis in order to be able to survive. A number of them have raised fresh equity, but others have raised none or very, very little. What options would companies have, coming out of this with very damaged balance sheets to try and repair that? Maybe we could talk specifically about Virgin Atlantic. They've been through a number of different perambulations in the last few months, but I can't imagine that they will need to do something more in terms of raising cash one way or another. What are the options available for airlines?
Well, it almost sort of sounds trite, but I suppose that the first thing to say, wouldn't it be lovely in an ideal world if, we could get back to a situation where airlines and other businesses more generally, if stuff could just generate some retained profits to help repair their balance sheet. But that's obviously hugely difficult at the moment. You'd look at opportunities to increase margins, you'd look at opportunities to increase your revenues and decrease costs. It's sort of, accounting 101, isn't it? But to do that, the focus has to be on making air travel as easy as possible for the consumer. But coming back to this point, it's within the context of these sort of confusing and inconsistent international rules. So, allow rebooking flexibility for consumers without financial penalty. But, that in itself is problematic because the business model traditionally hasn't worked that way. So all the things you sort of need to do to adapt to the current circumstances are, very much counterintuitive and not necessarily going to be the sort of thing that reconciles easily with trying to repair your balance sheet. It's actually expensive to allow complete booking flexibility. So, in an ideal world, yes, management teams would work carefully with operational specialists, like our esteemed panel here, and dare I say it, financial restructuring specialists like ourselves, to sort of really look at, what can we do? Management teams don't necessarily have the capabilities, no fault of their own. They're brilliant at running airlines, but they're not necessarily brilliant at running airlines in the jaws of terrible financial distress.
I don't know. That tends to be a fairly normal state of affairs for many airlines.
I suspect. So look, I suppose let's talk about raising fresh debt or equity. If you look at the announcements that we've had recently, the equity markets are yet to respond with any sort of great enthusiasm to start piling into airline stock. So that's going to be difficult. Going back to your shareholders, yet another sort of cash call for the shareholders, difficult. Raising sort of debt finance. When you're in a stressed or distressed situation, debt finance is generally a pretty expensive option. So you come on to sort of the formal restructuring tools. You mentioned Virgin. They were the first business, I believe, within the UK to take to avail themselves of a new restructuring tool recently brought in, formal restructuring tool. It's a Companies Act tool. We call it a restructuring plan. It's under Part 26A of the Companies Act, but it's a compromise arrangement with your creditors. We're very familiar with them. We've looked at a high street, for instance, CVAs, where we know these are these plans that you put to your creditors. When you really are in great difficulty, but the fundamental problem is that your balance sheet is in a state, and yet you do have a good business within there, within the company, you need to use a formal restructuring tool sometimes, and you need to go to your creditors and say, look, it's not nice, it's not pleasant, but you're all going to have to sort of adapt the basis upon which you engage with us as a supplier. You're going to only get sort of 70p or 60p or 50p or 30p in the pound on existing debt. But if we all do this and we're all in it together, it at least means we survive. You still have a customer and we still have a business. So, you know, there are those options. Cynically, I suppose one of the other things that airlines might, in the back of their minds, and they'll never admit this, maybe they hope that a significant minority of consumers won't use all of the vouchers that they've issued. And also maybe they will have to do things like, you know, devalue reward points. So all of a sudden, you know, your air miles don't get you what they used to get you. But what I would say as an insolvency practitioner is that the UK is very lucky. We've got a huge range of very useful formal restructuring tools. And when, you know, you're no longer in a position to actually do things consensually with your creditors, we are lucky that we do have CVAs, restructuring plans, and schemes of arrangement in particular, and also the administration regime. So for instance, Flybe went into administration, and ultimately parts of the business and the assets have been rescued in a certain way. We'll sort of see as and when they get back into the air. But help is out there, and it's just that step beyond the sort of taking advice from, you know, people like Peter and you and Ben on the sort of operational turnaround, and actually say, right now we need financial and restructuring turnaround expertise.
Yeah, maybe we could turn to Peter at this point on that, you know, question of, as airlines maybe begin to get a bit of visibility on the future levels of demand and, you know, how they need to resize their business to be profitable in the, you know, the new environment. You know, if you were brought in by, or when you were brought in by shareholders or whatever of those companies for advice, you know, what are the key steps that companies should be doing at this point?
I think there's a misunderstanding, I suppose, by a lot of people outside our industry, in as much that they think the airline industry makes lots of money. It doesn't. There are a notable few, and they get publicized quite a bit, but generally the airline industry, at least the airlines themselves, not so much the suppliers, who do pretty well out of supplying the airline industry, you know, the margins are very low. So therefore, and this was pre-COVID, so the situation they find themselves in now is obviously clearly significantly more catastrophic. And my concern, and what I would be advising, is to make sure that two things. One is, more than two things, but two essential things. One is the airline industry is internally often guilty of being operationally centric. We have to be, because safety is our paramount. You know, we don't want to hurt anyone. But often is at the expense of the customer, who's left at the periphery. And I think there has to be a change, perhaps, in terms of how the industry, the airlines, the airports and others treat their passengers going forward, because I think there's a huge opportunity for airlines to differentiate their product. It's not just a question of price at the end of the day. But that brings me on to my second point. And here I'm very cautious and worried. And you know as well as I do, Robert, that the airline industry chases capacity to the point that and that's understandable. The days of creating demand is still there, of course, and particularly so as we go through the current. But as we move forward, when more and more people will be flying, then airlines will, and particularly network planners, will have a tendency to put back lots of capacity to the point that probably there's more capacity in the market, and we all know what happens. And the cash income will go down based on a lower yield, and the balance sheet problems become exacerbated. I think the CEOs and commercial people in the airline industry have got to be very strong-willed to make sure they don't go chasing down capacity, and perhaps they concentrate more on the value of the product they're trying to give to their customer. Now, it's obvious that in the last 18 months or so, airlines have been forced into cutting costs simply because they haven't been flying. So therefore, there's an operational cost. I only hope, and we do know of a few that have gone through a robust process to make sure that when they are back in a better position market-wise, then they are a different organization to that which went into COVID-19. If no one's taken the opportunity to change, improve, radicalize their processes and procedures, become more technically astute, and understand how we can make sure that cost savings are not just for COVID-19, but for life, then I think there's a lot of airlines that have a great chance, providing they don't charge capacity. But yeah, you and I have been in this industry for a long time. We've seen it happen time and time again, and I'm very concerned that the same management companies, same management teams that were running these airlines pre-COVID-19 are still in place, and they're going to do exactly what they did before. And it's just going to make matters far worse, because the cash situation will inevitably catch up with them, because their balance sheets are swollen at the present moment with debt, unless the taxpayers give them lots of money, and that will only worse. The last point I'd make is, don't forget, I don't know how many millions of vouchers are flying around or not flying around, but that's going to have a big impact when capacity starts coming back and people start using their vouchers.
Yeah, absolutely. On the capacity question, I think one of the challenges is all airline managers and executives would agree that the industry needs to be disciplined on capacity. But at an individual level, the incentives are all there for your own airline not to be, to grow capacity more than the average. And particularly if you are an airline that is facing, extra competition from a Ryanair or a Wizz, both of whom have, I think, very sensibly taken the view that this is an opportunity for them to grow share, and they're growing capacity, what do you do? Do you just give up and die, or do you make it easy for them? What would you be advising an airline, I don't know, their TAP in Portugal, or someone who is, do they rebuild back to their previous network and make it at least a bit more difficult for the Ryanairs of this world to just take over Portugal? And they've pretty much taken over a lot of it already. Or do you take a more cautious approach and just allow the inevitable that you're pulling out of significant markets?
I think you've got to take the prudent course. You talk about TAP and other state-owned companies. Obviously, clearly they don't want to waste taxpayers' money, but most of our organisations need to generate profit, simply to generate free cash flow, as opposed to profit per se. So clearly, that's an important point. The issue for me is making sure that the airline builds back in such a way that they can be robust enough to support the deficits on their balance sheet going forward. I remember Tony Tyler, who was the Director General of IATA at his first conference meeting many years ago, said 11 times, I was there in Singapore or Sydney, and he said 11 times revenue ahead of cost. The airline industry is very, very Miss McCorber-like, happiness and unhappiness. It's a very simple business. It's complex what lies behind it, of course. But you have to drive down whatever your measurement is in terms of cost, be it cost per available seat kilometre or cost per seat, or whatever measurement your airline uses, and the relationship between particularly the legacy carriers, feed, particularly when the North Atlantic comes back and other long-haul flights are allowed, where substantial amount of feed is fed from North America or Europe. The balance, the complicated methods of mathematics between those two have to be fully understood. So I think the planning, the operational researchers are going to have and should be fully engaged at the present moment to make sure. So my argument would be not to chase capacity. I think I've been instructing my network and commercial people to make sure that we grow prudently, but be flexible to make sure that we can take advantage and we look for advantages. There's nothing worse than just watching your competition then reacting to them. People have done that with Ryanair and Wizz and come short. So I think Ryanair, Wizz Air and others will be highly successful. And I think perhaps this COVID-19 will set a significant paradigm shift in terms of the airlines we're likely to see in the future. And many of the ones we have today won't be here.
Yeah. Obviously, crises are great times for innovation. Changes which would have taken 10, 15 years have had to be done in weeks and months. Ben, what things have you seen? Good examples of innovation that have come out of the pandemic, and what more should people be doing as they come into the recovery phase?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention. And actually, over this last 12, 18 months, I've seen some tremendous innovative ideas that have been coming through, a lot in travel tech and across the value chain. Whether that's, we spoke about hotels before, hotels needing to become COVID safe, and travelers going anywhere need to feel COVID safe. So there are various different travel apps that have arrived where it shows you what the different regulations are in each country to tell you whether it's green on the UK, but from their perspective, what do they feel about UK visitors, and what do you need to do in terms of travel vaccinations and so on. So in terms of tech that sort of gathers all the information to allow you to plan your travel, and therefore that will help corporates in terms of allowing their staff to feel safe when they travel, through to contactless check-in procedures. I mean, that's been happening at airports anyway, but it's now happening in the hotel industry as well. And hotels where there's travel apps where actually you can order your food, you can check in, you can check out, and you can do a lot of things on your app on your phone, which allows the front desk staff to actually give that service level rather than process paper and put in forms. So there's a lot on efficiency, but there's also been great ideas within the travel tech space on what's right for the consumer in terms of that flexibility. And there are some travel insurance companies, insurtech companies that we know very well, that, for example, are offering that full flexibility for the customer to allow them to change their mind. And therefore, it allows the airline not to have to worry about that flexibility, and the insurtech company takes on that liability. And that's a great, exciting innovation. Others is in parametric insurance, where disruption is something that we used to worry about when the skies were full, but it still happens now with the increased processing at airports because of the various different protocols. So there are various different platforms that have been created to allow customers to rebook if they miss their connection, or rebook in case of disruption. And actually, from an insurance perspective, actually get their claim immediately handled because flights are being tracked. So there's a great insurance company that we know that deals with that. So there's a huge amount of innovation. About 10 million was invested in last year. It's sort of a massive slump, but we're seeing in the first quarter of 2021, more or less the same amount has been invested in travel tech startups than in the whole of 2020. So 2021 is looking bright for innovative companies that can either allow for cost efficiency, what Peter said, helping airlines and travel suppliers reduce their costs and improve efficiency, or to improve customer service and customer engagement, or to build increased revenue opportunities. So those are the three areas that travel tech companies have been focused on, and there's been a huge amount of innovation even in this pandemic period.
Okay, maybe just looking at the time, we should move on to the next topic, which is all about sustainability. Obviously, financial sustainability and resiliency is part of that, and maybe we could just quickly touch on that again. But I think what most people are concentrating on is the climate change type sustainability issues. Peter, what do you think is the chances of building back better, or is this just a nice slogan that people are using? Do you think there's a chance that the industry will make a step change forward in terms of its sustainability as it comes out of this crisis?
I think it will, and the reason for that is that unfortunately the airline industry and the aviation industry generally tends to hide its light under a bushel. Over the years, we've been exceptionally innovative in terms of being far better at performing. Engine power, fuselages become lighter, more efficient engines, and it's not as if we've not ignored that. I mean, technically, if you take those big fan engines that you see on the front of 350 or on the wings of 350s or 787s nowadays, 83% of that thrust is generated by what we call the bypass and not by the jet. Obviously, the jet's got to turn. So significant advances, and that will continue. I know
are you a believer in electric and hydrogen power sources?
Absolutely. I think we have to be, but I think there's a huge myth building up that suddenly, because you see a Tesla car running down the road, that you're immediately going to be followed by an A380. That's not going to happen. The law of physics still apply in terms of, as a pilot, I should remember these things, but lift over weight and thrust over drag, and there's an equilibrium there. So you can't put lots of batteries in a commercial airline and expect it to take off. But inevitably, with that and other opportunities, absolutely that's going to happen. It's just a question of when. I don't know, but certainly I do know there's a huge amount of investment and scientific knowledge going on to make sure that we can make the airline industry and the aviation industry far more sustainable and effective. We're obviously going a long way already in terms of mixing fuels and making sustainable green fuel more effective, but there's still huge opportunities. One of the projects we got involved, which unfortunately stopped in South Africa, was the availability of a plant that's part of the tobacco genus that can be harvested in difficult conditions 3 times a year and converted, and 30% of that can be added to kerosene, to jet fuel. And we saw that as a huge opportunity, not just simply to reduce the CO2 emissions, which is fundamental, but also helping local poor farmers in developing a crop that had some significance. So I think there's an awful lot that we do, and I think the aviation industry and the airlines should take a greater lead in generating that. But I think we've got to keep our eyes open. Our optimism is certainly directed in terms of inevitably there will be more technology to improve the sustainability of the airline industry. The airline industry won't go away, but I think in itself it will aid and abet greater efficiency and more responsibility.
So, Paul, given that, as we talked earlier, the aviation sector is going to need to raise further capital, I think, over the recovery period, investors are becoming ever more concerned about making sure that their investment is done sustainably. Do you think there's a risk that the industry will fail to attract capital because it's perceived as a polluter and doesn't tick the boxes of investors in terms of sustainability?
No, I don't think so. I suppose for a few different reasons. I mean, there are plenty of investors who are still, dare I say it, investing in tobacco companies, for instance, or fossil fuel-based companies, etc. But primarily the reason I think that there won't be any constraints on capital is that the need to consider sustainability will actually provide opportunities for innovation and new business models, which will really attract investors. I mean, there are actually hugely exciting opportunities ahead of us in the sort of the aviation sector. Greener aircraft, greener fuels, electrification, different type of aircraft as well. If we look at the moment, there are a number of. I think in the press last week there was sort of quite a lot about flying cars, which obviously a little bit sci-fi, but and they've never quite worked. But what will work, of course, are the sort of the sort of taxi type services, Uber Air type services. Consumers will really embrace this sort of stuff as well. So, and it's not only because these developments, flying on a greener aircraft or flying on an electric aircraft, that will sort of mitigate the guilt factor, as it were, and people will sort of think, oh, brilliant, I can now go with this particular airline that's flying, this 40-minute short hop from London over to Paris is now on an electric aircraft. Isn't that amazing? I don't have to feel as guilty. But also people are genuinely excited by the sort of development of new aviation technologies. I mean, you only have to look at things like when the A380 launched, people really liked flying on that aircraft. Obviously that's had its day, but
the CFOs didn't like paying the bill for it, unfortunately.
No, that's the thing. But, the 747, of course, absolutely loved Concorde, etc. People still sort of, get sucked into that glamour. There's still a real future, and you innovate and, you sort of move forward. And you can wrap sustainability into all of that. And if consumers like it, it's going to be good for the airlines. And if it's good for the airlines, then investors will pile in.
Yeah. We've now got the results from our poll. Maybe we should just cover that. So the scores on the doors were 36% of people would say they're going to be flying economy, 45% would fly business, 2% would fly first, and 16% would fly premium economy. So that doesn't look too different to the historical mix. I don't know what you think, Peter.
No, I think am I surprised? I'm comforted by the fact that that poll, for the reason that many airlines make most of their profits, if not all their profits, on business class on long-haul flights. And I see no reason why people shouldn't go back to flying business class on long haul, because why wouldn't they? Their economics may have changed in their company, but the amount of spend as opposed to the other costs is probably quite small. So I'm not surprised by that, but equally, paradoxically, I'm comforted, therefore, by the fact that the airline industry can enjoy, hopefully, as we move forward, people coming back into business class. The fundamentals of the economics of the airline, for many airlines, rely upon that. And as I said earlier, not just for the pure point to point on the long haul sector, but obviously all the major competitors are competing with each other to go over their hubs. So Lufthansa, KLM, Air France, British Airways, etc. So that'll have a big impact in terms of how they get their feed into their main hubs as well. So that's quite important.
Okay, we're getting close to the end. I'm just going to do a quick fire round. So I'm going to ask each of you one question, and if you could try and answer in one sentence or at most two. So Peter, if you were asked which would you be investing in, Wizz or Ryanair, where would you put your money?
I would. I'll certainly put money in both. I would not put it in any other airline. I would certainly be looking for investment. I think Wizz has got some great ideas from a customer perspective. Ryanair, as you know, had a bad reputation. I think that's changed now, and it's beginning to increase. But I think Wizz is probably ahead in terms of how people perceive. But an adjunct to that, an answer would be coming back to what I said earlier. This is a fantastic opportunity, supporting what Ben and Paul have said. I think for new airlines to come through, and I think you'll see a change, a shift with opportunities for new airlines who can start as of now with a very low cost and make sure they manage that, as opposed to the more legacy carriers that are still having massive problems shedding huge procedures, old costs, and just a process in their management minds that doesn't allow them to change as much as they should.
Okay, Ben, let's see if you can do a bit better, both in terms of sticking to one or two sentences and actually answering the question. So, Ben, will 2021 be better or worse than 2020 for airline revenue in Europe?
Oh, I think we're definitely seeing the trend is that it will be better. It will be better this year than last year, and hopefully 2022 will be better than 2021. I think we're on the upward cycle. I think just adding to the conversation on the sustainability. I think sustainability was on the agenda before COVID. It's definitely much more heavily on the agenda during this pandemic. The fact we've got the Jet Zero Council in the UK and other similar bodies elsewhere, I see that as very exciting. And even corporates have got together to pay. To commit to buying up front the investment required in sustainable aviation fuels, which is the delta between the cost of aviation fuel versus the sustainable aviation fuel. And so we're seeing business travelers who and corporations who are all looking at their own CO2 targets, and they're willing to commit up front to invest in that change. So I see that as a positive. And I also see multi-mobility as being a key thing for the future. So travel as we know it just on aircraft, but maybe a mix of aircraft and train, a mix of aircraft, train and last mile, and the technology platforms that are being built that can cope with that, those different interfaces of the different platforms so that they're harmonized into one booking. I see those are the kind of things that are happening which will help us for the travel industry going forward.
Okay. All right, Paul, you have the last chance to actually follow the exam question. Ben managed to answer the question, but at some length. Paul, what if you were a debt investor? Would you rather be holding airport debt securities or loans secured on aircraft at this point?
100% airport debt securities, and the reason being, it's easier to repurpose the asset. Simple as that.
Okay. All right, well done. So I'm just going to take the last couple of minutes just to maybe try and sum up. I think my sense is there's a fair amount of optimism that this isn't another false dawn for the industry here in Europe, that we are at the beginning of what should be a sustained recovery, undoubtedly with some bumps ahead, whether that is resurgence of viruses, inconsistencies between government policies, or supply constraint issues or other things that come out of the woodwork in an unexpected way. I think also a view that we've still got a long way to go to get the industry back into any kind of financial health. It's probably a task of years altogether. I'm sure we would all agree here on the panel that making sure you've got the right kind of management, that you've got the right kind of skills, and that many of those skills maybe are different from running an airline in normal times, and probably even different than they've been for running the airline in the last 12, 18 months, where everything has been really geared towards survival, liquidity, cash is king. In a way, that's quite a simple world to operate in. As we get back into a position of trying to build actually sustainably profitable businesses going forward in an environment which is going to be still rather different to the one the history will tell you about, that's a more complicated task. And I'm sure people leadership and people management skills are really come to the fore. The managements have been able to, if you like, abuse their staff, if you like, in the name of survival. But as you come out of this, really taking people with you, I'm sure is going to be an important part. We haven't talked about the cargo industry. I saw a number of questions on that. I think the cargo industry has been obviously one of the things helping to keep particularly long-haul airlines afloat during this crisis. I do think that's going to still be strong because wide-body capacity is not going to be coming back probably fast enough to change completely back to normal soon. But I do believe that, a year or two from now, we're probably going to have an excess of cargo capacity. We did before. A lot of aircraft have been converted to freighters. I'm short-term optimistic on cargo and sort of medium, long-term pessimistic on the cargo business. I think we're probably at time there. I don't know if, Peter, you want to say any final short words to sum up?
Well, I would like to emphasise the latter point you made about people management. I think no matter what industry you are in, we have to pull our troops through rather than push them through. And certainly they just don't need the optimism in terms of will my airline or my organisation be around. It's what opportunities provides them, and get them involved in terms of making sure they understand, and the board understands, and the management team, what the consequences are in having a robust workforce that actually is alive, kicking, and aware, and they're becoming more aware of the opportunities that we exist as human beings in terms of how we can perform an improved, better service, which is sustainable and good for the environment.
Absolutely. Well, all being sort of airline people for the most part, I guess we should have an on-time arrival. So I think we'll leave it there. I think the contact details of all the panelists are available. So if anyone wants to follow up with anybody here on specific opportunities to help you out on either as an investor or as being involved in aviation, these are the people we've been talking to today. And thank you all very much for joining the webinar.
Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Robert. Cheers, everybody.
Well, cheers.
Thank you.